So again, everyone, thanks for being here. This is our second brainstorming session for the SDGs Working Group, and we are doing celebrating as well the International Day of Monuments and Sites, which is this year's theme is Heritage Changes. So I don't know if you're aware, but every year for the last third year now in a row, I have been involved in crafting these messages of the International Day of Monuments and Sites. And as you can see, there will always be some SDG related topics in these conversations. The topic that we will have for this today is new technologies, sustainability, and energy. And we have two discussants that will be with us. So as usual, this brainstorming session is the point of discussion wherein we can listen to various perspectives of integrating heritage and sustainable development. And then we can create, this is a means of creating a shared base of knowledge, right? To level off ideas and principles to align actions. This is also a means to learn, co-learning with others and co-creation of knowledge to spark new ideas. And it is an informal space to think and share views, right? So no one's right or wrong. We are, our colleagues here are providing provocations or their projects to make us think a little bit differently. Now, for me, I started out thinking about this in the beginning when I was thinking of holistic sustainable development actions. There are some sites out there that are looking at sustainability in a bigger fashion. Bigger thinking. And I saw, when I went to Spain a couple of months ago, I saw Amilcar there, and he was explaining to me the work that they are doing. So I invited him here, and I did a bit of a research, which perhaps Amilcar can explain a little bit further later on, that Casa Batlló is a place where that is recognized by the Biosphere Sustainable. And it has a certificate, and they comply with certain, they achieve some of the SDG targets. But there are also other sites that are quite interesting, wherein they have a bigger holistic plan, like an environmental action plan, or that is in Sydney Opera House. The city of Leon is considered also as a creative and city and sustainable city. But that's a bigger scale, right? And this site, World Heritage Site of University of Virginia, they have a sustainability plan, which I will explain a little bit later. Now, what I was also inspired by is this idea of integrating new materials in the old fabric. Again, it's a question of, is it all about the looks, and is it better performing or not, right? So I hope that James can explain a little bit more of, is this really just a fashion? Is it really a good thing to have, or do we not want to have solar panels or new technologies in heritage sites? Tesla, if you see Elon Musk there, he's already advocating for his different type of solar roof tiles since 2016. And this company called Deacqua is in Pompeii in Italy, and I will show you a video of that. Just very briefly, this is the one of the environmental action plan of Sydney Opera House. I managed to get in touch with them as well, so they will be joining us for another brainstorming session in June. And it's quite interesting because for them, they have been looking at this environmental action plan for the three cycles now. And from what I understand, they are already carbon neutral. Now, in June, we will hear from them what that really means to be carbon neutral. They have done targets. Every cycle, they will do targets, and they will do some kind of indicators for their success. And at the end of that cycle, they will see if they can achieve those targets. The city of Leon is a different kind of situation. It is 59 municipalities and 1.4 million people. But what they did was to create a local urban plan in 2019 that looks not just at heritage, but also having different kinds of economic development for their city, and they're diversifying their development, and a master plan has done that. And that not just improve the heritage site as it is, but it is also improving the habitability of the historic center. The University of Virginia, what they did was to do a very simple strategy. I like what is here, which is very straightforward, 30 by 30, which is reducing, being carbon neutral and for fossil fuel by 2030, reducing their nitrogen losses of 30% by 2030, reduce potable water consumption by 30% by 2030. And with all these easy to remember information that they can actually monitor themselves in the next couple of years. But there's still a lot of different things that they do. But I think when sites start looking at what they can achieve, then it is also a means of tracking that kind of information. Now, lastly, I will show you the video, a 3-minute video of this Deacqua that I was just showing about. It is a startup from Italy, and let's play that video, and I'll introduce our colleagues afterwards.
What would happen if solar panels can be installed everywhere? The world's beautiful places were lost under a sea of blue panels.
But now we have the solution to install solar energy without visual impact.
How is it possible? With invisible solar. Indeed, invisible solar is identical to simple building materials. History is the base to build our future. Clearly, living in a historical town is beautiful, but is often difficult. In fact, the most eco-friendly features are banned, and the high maintenance cost push people to leave the heritage buildings for modern ones. But abandoned heritage disappears fastly, and we risk to lose it forever. This encourages a controlled urbanization that compromises the agricultural life and the ecosystem. The sustainable development and all building reuse are the answer, but solar panels are banned from the heritage because of their strong visual impact. Inspired by Vicenza, our hometown UNESCO World Heritage Site, we invented the first solar modules for the heritage. Invisible solar. Invisible solar is a building element with solar cells hidden inside. Its surface appears opaque, but is transparent to sun rays only, so they can activate the solar cells. Invisible solar produces many materials: backed clay, wood, stone, concrete, and even slate. It can be installed on roofs, walls, pavement, and all together. Invisible solar has a double role: energy producer and building cover. Also, it is eco-friendly, self-cleaning, ultra-strong, and beautiful.
Invisible solar roof tile is already in production, but with the support we will improve the production line and launch new shapes. Supporting us, we will get an exclusive crowdfunding edition sample, each one with LED source to show everyone how it works.
I'm not supposed to endorse anything, but just if you are curious, then you can look at the website and look at the Deacqua, and you can see what they have, and we can also discuss, is it right or wrong, right? So for today, we will have two discussants that I've invited. Amilcar Vargas is coming from Casa Batlló from Spain, and James Ritson is from the ICOMOS International Scientific Committee on Energy and Sustainability. Let me just introduce them shortly. Mr. Vargas looks at the implementation of the World Heritage Convention, raising awareness of the outstanding universal value and pursuing the potential opportunities of Casa Batlló's inscription to the World Heritage List. James Ritson is an architecturally trained building conservator specializing in sustainability and recording the existing built environment. And he's currently the program leader for MSc Building Surveying at the University College of Estate Management. And James is also an expert member of two ICOMOS scientific committees, the UK National Scientific Committee on Digital Heritage and the vice president of the International Scientific Committee on Energy and Sustainability. So I'll stop sharing here. The work is done, and then let me have Amilcar share his discussions.
Thank you, Gabriel. It's a pleasure to be here. Can you confirm you can listen to me?
Yes, we can hear you, yes.
Okay. I probably should have asked before how many time I have, but I did a brief presentation, very visual. Gabriel, how much time do I have?
15, 20 minutes, and then we will have, we can have a conversation.
That's amazing. We will have enough time for the discussion. So just give me a second and I will share the screen. So just a second. I guess this is it. Well, thank you very much. My name is Amilcar Vargas. I had the pleasure to meet Gabriel several years ago, almost 10 years ago, in a World Heritage the UNESCO World Heritage Committee meeting in Doha, when he was a student on Cottbus, the Brandenburg Technical University, and I was also a student on the master's degrees in the University of Barcelona. At that time, in Doha, 2014, the SDG were not yet adopted. Then in 1 year later, the SDG were adopted by the United Nations and very quickly by the UNESCO. I joined Casa Batlló for the first time in 2013 for doing the periodic report, the second cycle of the periodic report. Of course, at that time, I also worked for doing the management plan, and it was no SDGs at all. It was, of course, a narrative of sustainability, but not as clear and as focused as we have now. The SDGs in Casa Batlló then were indeed implemented more specifically since 2018, when at the end of my PhD, they called me to be in charge of the management of the World Heritage Convention in this World Heritage Site. Casa Batlló is a component of the UNESCO World Heritage Site, Works of Antoni Gaudí. It was inscribed in 2005, thanks to the extension of the original three properties that UNESCO inscribed in 1984. So, of course, we are located in Barcelona, and we are 7 components. Here in the map, you can see in the red area what is the extension of this very tiny site compared with the rest of the size of the city or of other components as the Sagrada Familia or Park Güell, who are very large. So we only have 15 meters of facade, just to give you an idea. We were inscribed based on criteria 1, 2, and 4 of outstanding universal value. It was a reused house transformed by Antoni Gaudí between 1904 and 1906. That's why we consider Casa Batlló as a sustainable born house, because Gaudí reused the previous building, a building from 1877. He transformed it in what is nowadays Casa Batlló. So it's a private house managed by its owners, a local family. So we are seeing a very outstanding example of local people managing their own heritage. So the owners of the house are the managers of the house. They are our bosses, and they are managed in a familiar way, but with the best experts they can find on different topics, including the SDGs. Well, as all of you know, in 2015, the 17 SDGs were adopted by the United Nations, and then later on November by the General Assembly of State Parties of the World Heritage Convention. So in 2016, before I joined Casa Batlló, we started doing a tradition, which is in this case the decoration of the balconies with roses, which also helped to contribute. We have then this how can I say, adopted this as an action that can contribute with the SDG 11, Sustainable Cities and Communities, Partnership for the Goals, because we have in the 2016 we have a partner to do this artistic installation, and with the SDG 1, No Poverty, because the NGO we supported with a solidarity action at that time was a NGO that helps people, homeless people, to find a home. So this is, sorry for being so specific in very how we have adopted in some examples the SDGs, because if we are here are to know about empirical facts on how can we merge the narrative of the SDG in the storytelling of a modernist style house. In 2017, for the first time, we decorated our facade with the LGBTQ plus flag in this way in 2017. So for the night of the 28th of June, which is the Pride Day, and then with this we supported the SDGs 5, 11, and 10 so far. Of course, the consequences of having this kind of decoration was very, very positive in terms of branding and in terms of social commitment with a global, historically segregated and discriminated community. So we were the first Gaudi property in having this kind of decoration, which is not just a decoration, but also a statement, a manifesto, and even the participation in the parade of the Pride in Barcelona. So, and in 2019, we joined a campaign done by the city of Barcelona that encourages touristic sites and tourism sector managers, hotels, restaurants, transportation companies to have a commitment with the SDGs, following some guidelines and having a criteria of a questionnaire of, and just following some indicators related very deeply with the SDGs. And then with these indicators, we joined this biosphere label as a committed entity, and in 2020 we were certified as an entity with the commitment of sustainability. So every year, thanks to this platform, we have a sustainability plan that we have to improve year after year. But what happened on the 20? Because in 20 we had to close the doors temporarily out of respect for our city, out of love for our beloved ones, and in order to help stop the spread of this pandemic and with the intention of preventing the collapse of the health system. So this is another example of how, even being closed, we can continue implementing the SDGs. So as I mentioned in 2016, we had this decoration with the balconies of the house with roses. And since the lockdown was again during the day of St. George, which is the cultural context of this decoration, St. George is tomorrow, so we are having these roses again in 2023. But in 2020, we didn't have the chance to put the flowers, the roses on the balconies. So we reinvented a new tradition and encouraged local people to put their roses in their own balconies. And because everything was closed, even the flower stores, we encourage them to recycle and reuse the material they might have at their home, and to have the feeling of celebration in their own balconies. Because in cities like Barcelona, the balconies became the platform where people were able to communicate each other, because they were in the lockdown, and Barcelona is a mostly apartment building city. So That's why balconies were so important. So in this action, we in this icon and scenography and new storytelling, it said if we can go out to the streets, let's full of roses. Let's do full of roses our balconies. And in the small letter it says, and if we don't have it, we will invent them. So, and the last statement says, we reinvent St. George, and we will do our own roses with whatever we have at home. So with this action, we try to implement these 6 SDGs, the 3, 4, 11, 12, 13, and 17. So this was one of the claims. This is an example of how we encourage online people to recycle and reuse, and there were several examples. And oh, well, probably it won't be able to be listened to, but the important thing is the video itself. So in this video, this is the result of what we did. So these are videos of the balconies with roses before the pandemic, but in 20 we were not allowed to do it. And then this is a video made of the collaboration of different people that they painted, they did craft with roses. We also help to reduce stress and to improve the well-being of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who participated in this collaborative action. And at the same time, we were keeping the intangible heritage alive as the traditions of St. George. Okay, so this action that was, as I said, reinvented 3 years ago, we won 2 awards, the Muse Creative Awards and the Heritage in Motion Special Mention Awards in 2020. And at the same time, when we reopened for the short time in summer, we implemented new hygienic measures, like the UV sterilizers of all our devices and gadgets that people use during the visits, contributing with SDGs 3, 9, 13, 11, and 12. And in 2021, we reopened again because we had to close again after the 3rd wave in October 2020. And we reopened just exactly 2 years ago in 2021 with a new partnership with an NGO that supports the social inclusion of people with neurodiversity, especially people with autism. So this is now one part of our DNA of the house, to contribute to the local to the labor inclusion of people with neurodiversity. And with this, we are achieving among others, the SDG number 17. And in the storytelling we have in the house, so we improve our storytelling, and also we updated and upgraded our tablet. And with this, we raise awareness about these different SDGs, the 4, 6, 12, 14, 15, and 13. This is not, our visit is not a lesson on SDGs or how to implement them at your home, but it raises awareness. And it's very important that a house that is visited by 1 million people per year, they have this message in a very lovely place, and in a very lovely, charming, and emotional way. And at the same time, in 2021, we won an award, the Barcelona Sustainable Tourism Award, for the best practices on the implementation on the SDGs for cultural sectors. And in our management plan that we are developing, the sustainability is one of the 4 pillars of our management plan. The other 3 are conservation, communication, and education. So these are our 4 pillars, and sustainability became one of them. In our previous management plan, the one I did in 2013, sustainability was not one of the pillars. There were conservation, communication, training, I don't remember the 4th one, but the sustainability, it was not that. So thank you for your attention, and I give the floor to Gabriel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think that's very inspiring in showing that you can influence the community, and also having sustainability as one of the core pillars of the management plan, which I was sharing earlier about sites really integrating sustainability in their plan of action. So well done, Amilcar. Okay, we will do the questions later. What we will do first is that have James present, and then we will have all the questions to both of you, or in discussions later, if you're okay with that, Amilcar. Yeah. Okay, let's have James share his insights on carbon neutrality, I think. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to take a slightly different point of view, taking on some of the points that actually Gabe absolutely unintentionally or intentionally, I don't know, I didn't know about, raised at the beginning of how do we think about our heritage in a sustainable world? And this came from a 10-year study that I did, which was part of my doctorate. And basically what I were looking at is an alternative approach to sustainability. And it's ended up with a term being coined called carbon value of our heritage. And I use this as an example, probably the largest stock of buildings that we have in the UK that we didn't have at the time a coherent strategy for. And those were historic buildings, and in particular our Victorian housing stock. And in the UK, that is a huge proportion of buildings, as I will discuss. So the premise for the study was actually came about halfway through, but it's actually the approach was the most sustainable strategy for owners of historic buildings, and particularly historic homes, laid not in a sustainably focused refurbishment, but applying the measures that we would apply if we were trying to conserve the building as building conservators. So as we were heritage professionals. And actually by looking after the building, doing the small improvements, the small alterations to the building, actually we got much bigger energy savings and much more cost-effective energy savings than we would as if we approached it from a sustainable engineer's point of view. And that's the premise of where we came from. Now, just to put some context in numbers, now I'm dealing with a huge housing stock. So the UK government has a target of net zero by 2050. We've got to deal with the existing built environment. We have the oldest building stock in the world in proportion wise. And because of that, our EPC, our energy performance certificate ratings for these buildings are the worst. They've got the highest carbon emissions theoretically of any of the housing groups ages, although that again is always questionable, but that's what the official data says. But twice the maintenance costs. And we saw in the video that discussion of people moving from historic properties to newer properties because of maintenance and so forth. And the big thing was we had 4.7 million of them just in England. Okay, so that is a lot of dwellings, and that works out as 425 refurbishments every single day from now until 2050. And if anyone's ever worked in building conservation, as I'm sure most of you will have, you will know that you can't do a building one conservation project in a day. Okay, lucky if you get everyone to turn up on the same day. So 425 refurbishments every day. So this was the challenge that we were facing. Okay, we had a huge housing stock that was responsible for a large amount of emissions that was readily across the England, and it was going to require something that could be easily applied. So the method was, well, what happens if we looked after the buildings? And the analogy that I gave was, if you had a car, you would take it in for a service. You would take it to the garage to have the spark plugs cleaned. You'd have the battery checked. You'd do all of those things. So what happens if we applied that same servicing methodology to our historic homes? And that's where we came up with the idea that building conservation-based strategy was the starting point for this sustainable refurbishment strategy. It was scalable. And that any of these projects, because of the size of the numbers that we were doing, it would have to be scalable, it would have to be transferable, something that you could easily do across the country. It couldn't be a building specific, had to be something that we could do across. It had to be cost effective. Bear in mind, during my study, we had the financial crisis. So the idea of people taking out £50,000 loans to make their house zero carbon was not very attractive. and it had to be affordable. Many of these homes were not just used by the affluent and the lovely homes that you see in the postcards of the UK. They were often social housing. They were often for people which we would call suffering from fuel poverty. So affordability had to be. And when we said it had to be scalable and transferable, it had to be something that was easy to understand. And that's what we wanted to make it, that you were looking after your building. And by looking after your building, you are going to get lower energy costs, and something that we are obsessed with in the UK, which is property value, how much your house is worth. It was going to add to the value of your property. So the next thing, we followed some of the conservation principles. So the ICOMOS one, doing as much as necessary, but as little as possible. We had Historic England making a statement saying one of the most energy efficient ways to preserve historic buildings is to ensure continued and regular maintenance. And so we came up with this term benign changes. So benign changes are changes to a building that have little or no effect on the heritage of the dwelling. Okay, they do not damage the dwelling fabric or the way that it can perform or react. And that was the strategy that we adopted. So we wanted to do benign changes to buildings, and what was the outcome? Now, before we could do some of these benign changes, we had to understand what was the heritage of the property. Now, to understand what is heritage, a doctoral study and probably an entire central study in its own right, but we wanted to simplify it. So we looked in the terms that builders, the general public, and particularly local councils, who were one of the major stakeholders in the project, were looking at. So we wanted to kind of put in three main kind of categories that heritage could have. The first one was the visual heritage. Now, we've just talked about that. Actually, how much a building would change during that intervention visually. The other was the fabric changes. Okay, so what was the loss of the actual historic material? Okay, what was the actual impact of the intervention on how a material would behave? And the other one would be the impact on the use. And one of the things that we've adopted in this use in the UK is that a building should be continually used to preserve its heritage. And that's the priority. The priority is not on its direct preservation, but in its continued use. So we wanted to make sure that what we were doing to the building was still making it usable. And in this case, still usable as a home. You know, people weren't suffering because they were living in a historic dwelling. Okay, and it was to remain a dwelling, or it was to remain a church if you're applying this policy to a church, shop, vice versa, all the way through. So we started looking at what were heritage-based conservation methodologies. So some of them were things like making sure windows and doors fitted correctly, draft-proofing doors and windows, hanging heavy curtains, reinstating historic shutters, making sure we had door closers on drafty buildings. If fireplaces weren't in use, making sure that they were sealed up with a balloon or a dampener, replacing the boiler, the heating system, updating the heating system with insulation and making sure it was working. So these were all things that we could do to a historic dwelling that weren't going to impact on its heritage, were affordable, and had an impact. And that's what became the benign changes. Now, there were a number that we did, and we came up with a few key ones that we could apply to historic dwellings. So one of the things that we found was there was questionable results on how you could insulate the walls. Okay, now in some areas wall insulation was really necessary, particularly things like the north of Scotland, the much colder climates. It was seen as a benefit, but actually as a general, and particularly in England where the project was based, actually we found there was much more benefits in actually making sure the roof was well insulated. It stopped the building overheating in the summer, and so it needed cooling, but actually it also prevented the majority of the heat loss. So you can see here that we were actually getting 30% energy savings just by insulating the roof. Okay, draft proofing the doors and windows, that was relatively straightforward. There were lots of proprietary kits. They can either be done by a professional or done by the homeowner. They were relatively easy, and they are available at nearly any of the building stores in the UK. Hot water insulation, again, a simple low-cost method that was still very successful. And rather strangely, in our current climate, we actually suggested fitting a high efficiency energy system. Now that might be a gas one, Now, at the time when we started the study, we made a cutoff point at 2012, and we used the data from that point onwards, and we used some of the updated data in 2015 for that data. We used a very high efficiency condensing boiler, and you can actually see just replacing the boiler to the most up-to-date gas boiler had a huge energy saving. The surprising one was improved heating controls. Just giving people the power to control their heating and hot water was the biggest shock. It was relatively low cost, and in fact most of the modern boilers and most of the things have these either controls ready to be installed very easily. A simple cable or a simple connection can be made, or they can be retrofitted into an older system. But that was one of the most cost-effective ways. Energy saving light bulbs, the one that we all think about, we actually found made very little energy savings at all. And if there was a bit major refurbishment going on, actually insulating the floor. But we found, and there was a caveat to this one, that if you were not doing a refurbishment, it was actually undesirable, but simply for the amount of disruption and the amount of effort it took to install. And actually the installation cost, if you weren't doing a building refurbishment at the same time, almost went up tenfold. So actually, if you were just to, as an individual measure, just say, right, I'm going to insulate your ground floor, and you weren't doing anything else to the property, the cost was anything between £5,000 and £10,000. So actually that was an interesting one. But the extra cost of insulating it, if you were doing a building refurbishment, was about £1,000 extra. So again, this is where we had that polarity between if you were already in a building and you weren't doing anything to it, or part of a refurbishment. But one of the interesting things that we found is that all of these measures, when we plotted all of the measures, and we did a lot of different measures, and we plotted these all on a graph between the cost of installing it and how much energy and carbon was saved. So that's the vertical axis against the cost. And we found all of these heritage ones lined up into this kind of this beige box here. And what it meant was, for the amount of pounds or the amount of euros or dollars that you spent on the refurbishment, the conservation method ones saved the most energy. And actually things like the solar panels, the ground source heat pumps, they were very expensive and didn't save as much. So actually we found that there was a point where this line, and when we putted a line of best fit across all of the points that we measured several hundred, all of them, no matter which project we looked at, no matter what we did, followed exactly the same curve. And there was a point in which the cost to benefit ratio actually started to tip towards you were just spending more money and getting very little savings. And that's when the curve flattened out. And we called that the tipping point. And that's when that value between economic, cultural, and historic and environmental values were in balance. So you're getting the most value economically, you were getting the biggest energy savings for the pound spent, and you weren't doing, because they're all conservation-based intervention, you weren't doing any damage to the heritage. And it's that point that we classified the carbon value tipping point. And that was the kind of the finding of the study. So I'm looking at time, so I'm very quickly. What would a typical process look like for a typical home in the UK if we're following this strategy? Well, you would take a typical home. You would have, first thing you would do is fit an energy efficient boiler. Okay, then you'll install some heating controls, insulate the hot water tank, maybe replace the hot water tank over time with multiple coils. This allows for newer technologies to be easily added without additional retrofit. Maybe think about a secondary source of heating or cooling. And then again, eventually in 2050, maybe think about replacing the heating system again. Now, these were based on typical timeframes. But one of the things that we didn't actually foresee, but we found as a benefit, this allowed this system to be, as a way of maintaining the building and constantly doing these small little interventions, it actually allowed for adaptability and flexibility over time as we change. So we found that the benign process had a lower impact on heritage. It was flexible, allowed for adoption. And the other thing that was very important for the homeowners and for the people who were looking after the building, the costs were spread. It wasn't a case of you're doing a big lump of intervention now and you were hoping that that would do you until 2050. You were allowing to adapt and change to the needs the requirements and so forth of the society as we move on. So it became a very good technico-socio intervention as well. And this actually put it into context in the sense that if we looked at the typical cost of a sustainability focused refurbishment, we were looking per dwelling between £20,000 and £50,000. If we were looking at the costs for some of these benign methods, we were looking between £2,000 and £7,000. And so when we apply that to the number of dwellings we have in the UK, you can see it goes from an upper range costs of £32 billion for the refurbishment of the historic housing stock, up to nearly 300. That's £1 billion. And that was where everyone started waking up, that actually we could get quite similar energy savings for less than a tenth of the cost. And that's what we've started to look at. So we came up with this term of carbon value, and it's that point of the tipping point that we got to. And this was the kind of the outcome. And it seems really hard that you do a 10-year study and what you came up with is this one little line, this one little equation at the end. Okay. But the most sustainable approach for a historic dwelling is to take your carbon target that you wanted to reach. So in this case, it was 0 carbon. And then you basically minus from that all of the interventions that you can afford to do that won't have an impact on the heritage. And then that is your carbon value. And it is at that point that you have to then make the serious decision. Is it worth economically and culturally preserving the heritage on going further? And that's up to the policymakers and it's up to the homeowners. Okay. And it's actually, that's where we began to define this carbon value of heritage. And that was a really key point for us. Actually, this is how far we can go without impacting on the heritage of the building by looking after the building within the cost frame that you have. And that became the carbon value. And typically, this is another example of how we define the carbon value as looking at our carbon emissions. But because of time, I'll just go to the conclusions. We were seeing easily within the tight cost for budget between 20 and 40% in all of our dwellings. The greatest energy savings in pounds per carbon or energy saved were from the maintenance and the benign changes. The planning conditions were still easily confirmable, and it still allowed for further intervention. So the use of solar tiles, the use for further interventions. This policy actually benefited that intervention for the implementation of further interventions, because it allowed the house was already ready for further investment if the client wanted to. And it allowed to lower their carbon emissions and energy consumption. And so we came up with this final statement that the triple bottom line of the carbon value of heritage is what you want to achieve minus what can be achieved within your budget and without damaging the heritage. And that's the point of carbon value. And I'll leave it there for today, the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, James.
Sorry, I overran by a few minutes.
No, it's okay. I actually took a lot of notes. I'm refurbishing a house in the UK, and then we were choosing some boilers, but okay. Noted that this.
I will caveat everybody who's been at the recent energy conferences and say all of this data was collected before the Ukraine crisis when energy prices spiked. So this is, I think I heard that statement about 50 times in the last energy conference I was at. So it's, again, things have obviously, and that's one of the things we were talking about, things change over in the future. So we do have to look at some of that, the data again, new energy prices and again, of course, new government incentives and costs and so forth.
Correct. Okay, so good, James, thank you very much for that. So I think we have two different points, right? So Amilcar provided sustainable development in a broader sense, where what a heritage site can contribute to the community and how it achieves the SDGs in their own way. And then James was looking at a more particular one for carbon and how do you really calculate this from a consumer point of view. Let me know if you have questions, but if you are thinking of questions first, I can start a question first for Amilcar. If if you don't have a question.
Yeah. Yes.
So okay. So Amilcar, yeah.
I read a question from.
Oh yeah. Okay. Go ahead then. What was the question?
About the question was about the community participation on the decoration of the facade.
Okay.
And about who was the idea of.
Oh, sorry, Adriana was asking a question. Yes, please. Yeah, please.
Continue. Yeah. Sorry, I had to move to another device and restart my computer. So the team of Casa Batlló has been growing since 10 years ago, starting from 15, and now we are 45 people. So among this diversity of people, there are foreign people, LGBTQ people, and people with different awareness, many of them millennials, people who were born in the 80s and 90s. So they have a different perspective of what is society and what is the city they live and they want. And because our internal organization is a very family-run museum, family-run monument, they are very, very aware of the needs of the society in Barcelona, but with a very global perspective. Very, very global. That's why we have all, of course, there are endless amount of initiatives and worries at the local, regional, or national level, but we want to focus on the ones that our team wants to be focused. And that's why the LGBTQ the illumination and the limited amount of lightings we have, because the city hall has a regulation very strict on the amount of days in the year that we can have a special light. So it's been a challenge. So we would like to have a lot of commitments, but we have a restriction because we are a World Heritage Site. And the idea of decorating the facade with roses was an internal proposal. And the idea of lightings for special occasions is also internal. So it's our team who decides what are the decorations, the lightings we will have.
Amilcar, was there also International Women's Day? That I saw that there was a purple color that was put into Casa Batlló as well, right? So you also did you also do that as well?
With what day?
The International Women's Day. International. Is
it? I don't remember that day.
Okay.
Which day of the year is?
Well, I can't remember the International Women's Day for the moment, but it is purple.
Yes, the International Women's Day. Yes, it's the 8th of March. Yes.
March 8th.
Yes, March 8th. Yes.
So you also do that. So not just the LGBT side, you also look at the women's International Women's Day.
We have 12. So far, I'm telling this by heart. We have 12 different illuminations, starting with March 8th. We also have the 8th, the AIDS Day on the 1st of December. We have a special lighting for Christmas, but it's not that global. But punctual and on a date, we have the International Autism Day. We have the Hour of the Planet. We have the International Women's Day, LGBTQ. What else? Yeah, so far those.
Okay.
That I can remember.
So quite inclusive then.
Yeah.
Good. There was a question from Nick as well, Nicholas to James. One of the largest challenges in energy reduction in housing is user habit. Do you look into what differently lifestyles may mean for operational energy use?
Yeah, we did, and in fact, quite interesting, and that's why I ended with a quote with that presentation from Winston Churchill, which was the first we shape our buildings and then they shape us. We actually found that was actually a big variable, and particularly one of the findings that we found was that the static, the EPC, that's why I started that caveat, apparently, and the SAP score, because it was very static, it made a presumption about your behaviour, actually became more and more inaccurate, more historic the building was. So one of the things that we actually looked at was, and one of the future challenges, and obviously I only had 15 minutes for a 10-year study to talk about, but one of the things that we found was, as we get more and more smart data and people more and more understand how to use their homes, smart meters had a big impact, smart heating controls had a big impact. And I think that was one of the big look at. And actually, we also found that people, weirdly, and there was an interesting environmental study that we brought in, people accepted much broader environmental conditions in their property if it was historic than they would as if they were in a new build. So they were much more critical of, maybe if you bought a new house, maybe you're like, you go to a 5-star hotel, you expect everything to be perfect. You only pay for a 2-star hotel. You go, oh, well, maybe. And actually, it was interesting that the people who lived in the historic properties, even though they had less control of their exact environmental, actually found themselves more comfortable and less critical of their environment. And it was kind of weird. It doesn't meet the facts, but actually that was it. But we've typically found that around 10% inaccuracies, 10 to 15% inaccuracies between the static controls and standard behavioral changes when people weren't making specific active measures to reduce costs. So if they were just carrying out their normal day without specifically thinking, I need to save energy, I need to save energy, I need to save energy, there was about a variability between 10 and 15%.
Interesting. There was also a question from Chance. Do you want to ask your question to James? Yeah. Chance, do you want to ask a question, or I can also read the question?
Oh, yes.
Is it one about have I published, and is there more on it?
Oh, yeah. No, the graph on the.
Oh, right. Sorry.
Yeah, I just want to know the data or the number of case studies you already studied or collected behind that graph.
Okay.
And if any literature reference linked to the study that I would love to read more.
Okay, yes, we have. Basically, we looked at 20 different typologies of historic housing that we found in the UK. And then basically we plotted all of the different interventions that we could do to those to create that graph. And then we also produced that type of chart for each of the properties or each of the studies. So sometimes there were a number of buildings within the same study. And we actually found that they all followed exactly the same shape. And that was the big discovery, that it all was, you spend a little bit of the thing, you get a lot of savings, and then actually you get to a point where it doesn't matter how much you spend, you just end up spending huge amounts to get up to that stage. So it typically got between 40 and percent savings, and above that we started to get much more expensive to save, the next 10% and the next 10%. It just kept on getting more and more expensive to do that, almost exponentially past that point. So it's about 20 different buildings we measured that policy. Okay.
Okay. There's also some questions. I had also a question for everyone, but which I think is a good point for discussion. But let's go back to Amilcar first for Donovan's question on the VLRs. Do you think that do you calculate? Do you do VLRs for Barcelona, and do you contribute to that? Yeah. That's for Amilcar. Does Barcelona do VLRs, and does Casa Batlló contribute to it? Amilcar, did you hear what I was saying? Yeah. Wait, do you hear me, Amilcar? Okay. If he doesn't, did you hear what I was saying? Oh, can you hear me?
I can hear you. I'm trying to go back to my computer. Just give me 1 minute.
Okay, so then we asked James the question first on do you calculate the time that the energy savings paid for the improvements? That energy savings
Yeah,
paid
the cost payback period. Yeah, we did. And this was one of the things that we found. For example, the things that we would typically be asked to do were things like double glazed windows. We were never getting the money back. And actually the cost of refurbishment. It was interesting, though, that when we actually started speaking to homeowners about some of these things, some of the measures they wanted to implement weren't to do with energy. So, for example, the requirements for double glazing were an insurance one because of the city dwellings. They couldn't get house insurance if they didn't have double glazing or secure rated glazing, which of course single glazing never is. So that was an interesting finding, that actually there were a lot of other ways that homeowners think about when they're doing a refurbishment on that. What we found was, again, and maybe due to the weather in the UK and maybe due to some of the implementations that we have and some of the limitations, that some of the sustainability based conservation methods actually took a huge amount of time. So photovoltaics, even with the reduced costs, was still not getting any payback period for 10, 15 years. And actually you were getting, on the benign measures, you were getting your payback period sometimes within the same year. So things like the insulating your hot water tank, that paid for within under a year, and it was very, very quick. So that was one of the things that we did look at, is the payback period, because actually the average tenure for a property in the UK is about 8 years. For historic dwellings, weirdly, it's 16 years. But people wanted to see that benefit within that time. And that was one of the things that we did consider, yeah. But the historic ones, again, improved over the more typical sustainable refurbishment interventions.
Nicholas, do you want to say something about that? Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to ask James another question. I don't know if you're aware of the two already quite old studies that came out of the US, which I'm sure Donovan knows much more about. They were done by the Preservation Green Trust, and they looked at life cycle costs of refurbishment. The one was called The Greenest Building. The other one was called Saving Windows, Saving Places, something like that. Fantastic studies. And I spoke with someone a while back and asked whether these studies had any effect. And these studies proved that the reuse, for instance, or sorry, not just the use of existing windows augmented with, for instance, additional internal paint, etc., was much more beneficial than replacement with double glazing. And I asked whether this message had any impact, and the answer was no, because people want to invest into their homes for resale. So how do we break that loop?
Well, it was actually interesting in the UK. Now, this is again in the UK. I spoke because this was one of my concerns, that people will say, oh, you know, when you go and buy a house, you want it to have a nice new kitchen, a nice new things, and you wanted everything to be working. Actually, when we spoke to estate agents, particularly more valuable the property, a well-restored historic property is much more valued in the UK than one that's had, and actually they were, particularly in the bigger urban areas, London, Manchester, Birmingham, and so forth, actually you putting in double glazing and removing the sash windows was seen as a cost drop. And actually they wanted the aesthetic, the original, and they wanted something. So actually the most valuable property per square meter was a well-maintained, a well-restored historic property. Now that might be due to the British always living in the past, and I'm being self-deprecating here. We like to all imagine that we're still the rulers of the world and we're still the best and everything and so forth. But actually there is a very interesting point on that, in that one of the perceived values of what you should be doing to make your building more sellable actually did go against some of the conservation based. Now, where that has changed is the mandatory implementation of EPC certificates, and how some of the historic dwellings now are performing very badly on EPC, but actually in real life are performing very well. And this is the big thing that we're looking at now, is how do we begin to question that? Because there's actually a rule now that if you are in a rating of anything below an E, you can't sell your property as a habitable dwelling. But actually we're seeing that the historic dwellings that are in an E actually should be in a C or a B. It's just because the standardized framework for testing doesn't work for historic buildings. And that's the big problem that we have. So to answer your question, but actually we interestingly found out about the greenest building is one that already exists. That study, that one's been adopted by REBA in the UK, the RICS in the UK. So that's the architects, the surveyors. That's been adopted as our policy. The greenest building is one that already exists. So retrofit first is now the policy in the UK. And the big thing is it takes 35 years, even if you build a zero carbon house, absolutely no energy, just because of the amount of embodied energy. So if anything that you do to your house, you've still got to count for 34 years of embodied energy costs. So that's where that life cycle cost has an impact, that you've got to be showing that it's really energy saving. And essentially the only way you get that money back is if you're carbon positive in a major way because of that build cost, because embodied carbon is not taken into account.
So I think there's a need to have another study for historic buildings and really what is energy efficiency in there as compared to all your usual
Peter Cox has published a very good study that's been done with ICOMOS Ireland, which has been adopted in the UK, Heritage the Future. And again, he's done a lot of looking at that embodied cost of heritage versus refurbishment versus rebuild. So demolishment and rebuild. And that's been hugely influential, certainly in my study, and a lot of people have been quoting that. Yeah.
Okay, let's go back to the question for Amilcar. I think he's back in. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Gabriel. Thank you for the question. As far as we know, we were not included in this voluntary report. Thanks to Gabriel that we are now aware of it, and now we know what's the door we have to knock in the city council to say hello. We are in Barcelona and we are committed with the SDGs. Thank you so much.
I just saw in the VLR website that the city of Barcelona submitted something in 2022, and I think it is really a potential for your institution to contribute, because if they do that kind of submission, then you can say that other institutions, private institutions, do it as well, even just for target 11.4, because the private sector is good to report for target 11.4, and it can be contributed to the city. Yeah. Okay. Are there the other questions? I'm seeing a lot of questions. Does anyone want to raise hand and ask the questions directly? So I can prioritize. Wait, let me see. I think John had a question to James. Were owners accepting the benign intervention to preserve historic fabric? Do they care? Yeah.
Sorry, can you read the question again? Sorry, I didn't see.
Were owners accepting the benign interventions to preserve the historic fabric? Do they care about these things?
Yeah, I think they did, because actually one of the things that we also found out is that, I mean, one of the things that we'd also looked at is if you encourage people to look after their homes in the same way that they would, say, a car, you would take it for a service, you would have it maintained, the benefit to them was greater. And actually this kind of rang true, probably because of the analogy of the car ownership, because of things that they recognized it. And it was that part of the thing where actually, I think one of the biggest problems that we have in the UK is we don't like change. We like everything to stay the same. It's our kind of our national, and anything that changed, we like to moan about. That's if I was to say what our inherent heritage or intangible heritage of the UK characteristic is, we like to moan. And so if there was something that we could do in the UK that people were used to, and actually having your boiler serviced and actually just looking after your building was something that they were used to. And actually being told that actually you're going to get some energy savings if you do this. And actually, if you go and get, you just looked after it, you repaired, you did it. People were much more welcome to that than being forced to say, rip out something and replace it with something they didn't understand. And that was one of the things that, and in fact, now it was interesting speaking to Baxi, who make the ground source heat pumps, the air source heat pumps, the gas boilers, all of the heating systems, they actually in the UK market have to make them look similar as the old boilers because people don't want it to change. And it's actually, I mean, one that's a practical measure in that one day they will fit in the same space, they will fit in the same area. There is some practical ones, but actually they do have this conscious thought is, no, people don't want anything new. They want to do the same thing. They don't care what's inside, but they want to understand that that thing in the corner heats their house and heats their hot water, and they don't want to, and that's it. And so actually that not wanting to change fits into that looking after kind of methodology. So there was a lot of, favorable things. And what was actually interesting, one finding we did find is that people actually really got into it, doing it themselves, rather poorly at times. I did see some rather interesting draft proofing sticking out at right angles and so forth around doors and windows. But actually, people really got into it, and they kind of began to actually enjoy and actually then began to appreciate their value. And I don't know if anyone knows about the kind of the heritage cycle of first you value it, then you look after it, then you appreciate it, then you look after it some more, and that cycle continues. We actually found that actually happened with people. We did with some students, we did the £5 refurbishment box on how to make your student accommodation for 1 year more energy efficient for £5. And those students absolutely loved it because they found they got ownership over their own property. So it was a kind of an interesting, a way that we didn't even think people would.
Good. So, okay, I think Paolo wants to say something, and I will go back to my question afterwards on what you think about World Heritage and management plans, which I think some of you have been sharing your thoughts. Okay, Paolo.
Hello to everyone. Well, I'm talking, knowing the theme, you see my house, 16th century, not heritage, but ancient, and quite nice value. In Italy, we are starting to make a very deep reflection because we are obliged by the European rules on energy adaptation and saving to adapt all our houses in a certain way with very, very expensive installation costs, and some of them incompatible with the heritage buildings. For example, you were talking about changing the boiler. I did it. Putting balloon in the chimney. I did it. Changing some windows where I could. I did it. And the costs are very, very high. The roof, I cannot intervene because I should change my ancient tiles who are centuries old, and we cannot do it. So we started a reflection. I sent you a paper. I don't know if you received it. We will have now a meeting in a seminar in Rome in June about the use of hydrogen as alternative in all the housing systems, not only in the ancient. And reading all the papers and all the documents we had there, we were realizing that hydrogen could be very interesting where we cannot intervene with insulation interventions and systems without touching the characteristics of the buildings. For example, in all the roofs that we cannot change because we will change completely the view of our small towns, cities, and so on, we are discovering that probably it's costing less anyway to have a cheap energy like hydrogen that is combining maybe energy arriving from other renewable ways like wind or like solar panels not put on the building itself, but having the hydrogen. There are existing many examples in the report I sent you in Holland of neighbors already working on that. In UK, they're selling individual catalyzers that you can make hydrogen in your own home. So the idea is a reflection. If maybe we can start thinking that this is almost impossible to preserve the characteristics of the heritage building and obtain at the same time what is requested now for climate change rules and so on. So this is a question that I'm putting you. I sent you is a brief paper that I've been preparing, and all of you are interested to think about that it can be maybe a way to go on these things, okay?
Pablo, can I make a reference to that? Is that I've come across this a lot, and particularly with the European regulations because of the division in this. And it's often as much to do with actually looking at how the buildings are rated for their energy performance rather than actually how the building is actually performing. And this is one of the big problems. And one of the things I would argue about is the recent studies that have actually shown how historic buildings in a warming climate actually perform much better. And one of the things that we're finding, and particularly in Italy, I know Italy, northern Italy has been quoted a number of times. I don't know where you're based in Italy, Paolo, but actually one of the things that they've found is that historic buildings are going to be much more adaptable and much more energy efficient in the warming climate by 2050 than the new build. However, the European incentives that you're talking about and the European directives do not take any account to this. And this was one of our criticisms. And we actually, as the International Scientific Committee at ICOMOS, we were asked to comment. And that was our comment. Our comment to them is, how are you measuring that? And are you using the same measure for historic buildings as you were for modern built buildings? And because this is where the problem lied. And again, I totally agree with you. There comes a point where we need to look at that balancing what you can do to a building and understanding what are the economic limitations and what actually are the environmental perceptions. And actually the environmental actual efficiency isn't being accurately covered by the current methodologies. On another point that you mentioned about hydrogen, that's something that we're doing in the UK. All boilers will need to be hydrogen ready. We're having about a 20% mix in the UK. So we're mixing natural gas and hydrogen together. So that's one of the things that we're doing in the UK. And eventually by 2050, by 2030, no new gas boilers can be put into new builds. And by 2050, the gas will begin to be tapered off. So it's a stopgap in between. So hydrogen is being used in the UK as a mix with our natural gas. But yeah, I would actually argue that actually it's the way that they're measuring the historic buildings is a big problem, because you're not getting anywhere near the accuracy of actually what these historic buildings are actually consuming. I've had buildings that have got a G rating and a 0 carbon, and I've just thrown them out, because they work on biomass, local biomass. They use solar powers for the lighting, and yet because they don't have any of the technologies, the current rating system just puts you as the worst performing, and that's the ridiculous thing. And historic buildings are often getting defaulted down to that worst setting on those policies.
So it's really a question of measurement as well, and how these things can be done.
Yeah, static measurement does not work for historic buildings.
I had snow till not long time ago. I'm 500 meters high, and the whole half of our patrimony, in Italy, is really, really old. And we are asking that we cannot respect the same obligations for the new buildings as half of Italian patrimony. And this hydrogen, I was starting to investigate a few months ago, is existing the technology from almost 70 years old. That has never been applied, because there were other type of interest around it. I am having the house with natural gas, but the cost has been it is so expensive that we are all thinking really to make a shift to something completely different, because it's impossible to maintain such a rich patrimony. I would say it's 20%, 25% of the whole country, with respecting what is requested now for the rules. And hydrogen that now can be stored, and it can be stored at home, at neighborhood level, at town level, should be a perfect solution. But okay, depending on the rules and all the rest.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Paolo. So what I will do is, I'll do save the recording, send it to everyone, and then if you didn't see Paolo's paper, I will send it out as well. Okay, so we're coming to nearly the end, and I just wanted to go back to that question of heritage management plans, because I do know that some sites do have built it in to have an environmental management plan or to have a sustainability plan. But as Nicholas has said, not all sites actually do it. And the World Heritage Convention don't really force people to change the management plan, because management plans are always based on managing the outstanding universal value, right? It is more of a personal incentive, a personal, let's say, desire of the site to be more looking at the bigger picture. And unfortunately, it's not the case, right? So the incentive to change management plans are not that great, unfortunately, right? So does anyone have some thoughts on management plans in particular? Or okay, James, what do you want to say?
One thing I would say is, if one of the studies that we looked at was the Foster and Keenan study, and it became the basis of one of the things that actually, if you look after your heritage, it becomes much cheaper to. And so by maintaining your heritage, it's by far a cheaper way of doing it than it is to just wait till something goes wrong and repair it. So if you look after your heritage, your preventative maintenance and all of those things, it's far cheaper than just waiting for something to go wrong and then fixing it. And that study is long old. So I would say one of the things that you can incentivize management plans is to actually say a maintenance as part of that heritage, looking after your heritage, is actually a really cost-effective way. And I know I don't want to sound negative in this group, but actually some of the people, everyone in this group wants to look after the heritage, but don't presume that everybody in the world does. You know, but actually, if you say to people, it's actually really cost effective to do what we're saying at ICOMOS, to look after your buildings, this is the most cost effective way of doing it. And what my study shows is actually, if you look after your buildings, you also save energy. So you're meeting some of those. And I think that those kind of incentives are beginning to make pay kind of dividends in the UK. People are beginning in facilities management to be really shifting towards preventative maintenance. So I think that's a way of thinking about it in that kind of management plan, that if you do this, it's not only going to improve your environment, it's actually going to save you money.
Yeah. I think the question there is long-term thinking, right? If you maintain, then what is it for you, right? Because some of the incentives for conservation is that there are money that is coming in for conservation 10 to 15 years in a row, or like not every year. And then they will want to go for that, let's say, big renovation, which will be funded by the EU or the government or the local council. So again, it's a mind shift that needs to be done, that, hey, you have to take care of your heritage site on a daily basis so that you actually will have a prolonged life. It is better to do it small steps, as you say, benign interventions, rather than the big major overhauls, right? Okay, so I think that's good. So thank you very much again for James and Amilcar. Wonderful conversations as usual. And thank you also for those questions that you've had. It is here in this group that we really think about heritage and sustainable development and finding ways of creating new solutions. And I do hope that you get inspired and think about in your projects or even at your homes. As James said, benign interventions are good. If you can do some small tweaks to your house to make it more energy efficient, then it also will be more sustainable. Thank you very much. Wonderful session. And then I will see you again next month in May, and have a wonderful weekend. For those who are celebrating the end of Ramadan, happy Eid to you. I think I forgot to mention that this is a holiday for the Muslim world, and thank you very much for coming here today as well.